I have lived through the most catastrophic century in European history, 2 world wars that shattered the continent's illusions about progress, civilization, and human nature. What I witnessed during those dark decades was not merely the collapse of political systems, but the spectacular failure of intellectual certainty itself. The same minds that had proclaimed the triumph of reason, science, and enlightenment stood helpless before the rise of totalitarian movements that promised simple answers to complex problems. As a young man, I watched my professors at the École Normale Supérieure struggle to comprehend how their elegant theories about historical progress could coexist with the barbarism unfolding around them. Today, as I observe American political discourse increasingly polarized between competing certainties, I cannot help but see disturbing parallels. The lessons Europe learned through unprecedented suffering offer essential wisdom for any democracy that believes itself immune to the seductions of ideological thinking. Chapter 1: The Intellectual Foundations of European Catastrophe. The tragedy of 20th century Europe began not in the trenches of 1914, but in the lecture halls and salons where intellectuals had convinced themselves that history followed predictable laws. Whether Marxist dialectical materialism, racial theories of national destiny, or naive faith in automatic progress, European thought had become dangerously systematic. Each ideology promised to explain everything, the past, present, and future, through a single interpretive framework. I witnessed firsthand how this intellectual hubris translated into political disaster. The same professors who taught elegant theories about historical inevitability found themselves helpless when those theories justified mass murder. Socialist intellectuals who had predicted the withering away of the state watched in horror as communist parties created unprecedented tyrannies. Conservative thinkers who had celebrated organic national unity saw their ideas twisted into racist ideologies that destroyed the very civilizations they claimed to protect. The fundamental error was the belief that complex social reality could be reduced to simple formulas. European intellectuals had forgotten a basic truth: human societies are irreducibly plural, uncertain, and resistant to comprehensive theoretical mastery. When political movements promised to eliminate this complexity, whether through class struggle, racial purification, or technocratic planning, they were really promising to eliminate the human condition itself. What made this particularly tragic was that many of these intellectuals began with genuinely noble intentions. They wanted to end poverty, create justice, build rational societies. But their commitment to systematic thinking led them to ignore inconvenient facts, dismiss contradictory evidence, and eventually justify horrific means in service of their theoretical ends. The road to European catastrophe was paved with intellectual good intentions married to methodological dogmatism. My generation of French intellectuals faced a particularly acute version of this problem. We had been educated to believe that rigorous theoretical analysis could unlock the secrets of social development. We approached politics as if it were a branch of applied mathematics, seeking elegant solutions to messy human problems. This intellectual formation made us vulnerable to the seductive power of comprehensive ideologies that promised to make sense of historical chaos. The German case proved especially instructive. Here was the most intellectually sophisticated society in Europe, the land of Kant, Hegel, and Weber, yet it produced the most systematic barbarism in human history. This taught me that intellectual sophistication provides no protection against political folly when it becomes divorced from empirical humility and moral restraint. Indeed, sophisticated intellectual systems may be more dangerous than crude prejudices because they provide seemingly rational justifications for irrational acts. What I learned from watching Europe's intellectual elite lead their societies toward disaster was the need for a fundamentally different approach to political thinking, one based on skeptical empiricism rather than systematic theory, on provisional generalizations rather than universal laws, on acceptance of uncertainty rather than pursuit of absolute knowledge. Chapter 2: How Democratic Institutions Failed Under Ideological Pressure. Democracy requires something that proves remarkably fragile: the ability of citizens to live with uncertainty and disagreement. What I observed in the collapse of the Weimar Republic was not primarily economic crisis, though that certainly contributed, but the intellectual inability of democratic politicians and voters to accept the messy, incomplete nature of democratic governance. Faced with genuine problems, unemployment, social tension, international humiliation, too many Germans became convinced that democracy was inadequate precisely because it offered no final solutions. The Nazis and Communists, despite their mutual hatred, shared one crucial appeal: they promised to end political uncertainty forever. One would establish racial unity, the other class unity, but both offered escape from the demanding work of democratic compromise. The tragedy was that democratic institutions actually functioned reasonably well given the circumstances. Parliamentary debate identified real problems. Civil society organizations developed practical responses. Federal structures allowed for local adaptation. But none of this satisfied populations that had been taught to expect comprehensive solutions to comprehensive problems. I learned that democracy's greatest vulnerability is not external enemies but internal impatience with its own procedures. When citizens begin to see democratic debate as mere obstruction rather than essential protection, when they start viewing political opposition as treason rather than necessary criticism, democratic institutions become hollow forms awaiting authoritarian capture. The Weimar Republic fell not because its institutions were poorly designed, but because too many citizens and intellectuals had lost faith in the democratic process itself. They wanted politics to deliver certainty, unity, and final answers, precisely what politics in a free society cannot and should not provide. This is why defending democracy requires not just good institutions but citizens educated to appreciate democratic virtues, tolerance for ambiguity, respect for opposition, and commitment to procedural fairness even when outcomes disappoint. What struck me most was how quickly democratic norms could erode when subjected to ideological pressure. Politicians who had previously respected constitutional limits suddenly discovered emergency powers. Intellectuals who had championed civil liberties found reasons to support restrictions on political opponents. Citizens who had valued pluralism decided that democracy was a luxury they could no longer afford. This erosion followed a predictable pattern. First, certain political positions were declared not merely wrong but illegitimate. Then, procedural safeguards protecting these positions were characterized as obstacles to necessary action. Finally, the suspension of normal democratic processes was justified as temporary measures to protect democracy itself. The French experience during the 1930s provided another instructive case. The polarization between left and right became so intense that each side viewed the other as an existential threat to civilization. Parliamentary government became nearly impossible as politicians spent more energy denouncing opponents than addressing practical problems. When faced with external threats, this internal division made effective democratic response almost impossible. What I concluded was that democratic institutions require more than formal constitutional structures. They need political cultures that value democratic virtues over substantive outcomes, citizens willing to defend democratic procedures even when those procedures produce disappointing results, and intellectual leaders committed to empirical reasoning rather than ideological purity. Chapter 3: The Seductive Power of Totalitarian Simplicity. What struck me most about totalitarian movements was not their brutality, that came later, but their intellectual appeal to sophisticated minds seeking comprehensive explanations for social complexity. Both fascism and communism offered what democratic politics could never provide: total explanations for historical development coupled with promises to eliminate fundamental human conflicts forever. I watched brilliant academics, artists, and writers embrace these ideologies not despite their education but because of it. They had been trained to seek systematic understanding, to find underlying patterns, to construct comprehensive theories. Totalitarian ideologies satisfied this intellectual hunger by providing what appeared to be scientific analysis of historical forces combined with clear programs for political action. The communist promise was particularly seductive to intellectuals because it claimed scientific status. Marxist theory presented itself as the physics of society, objective, predictive, capable of revealing the hidden laws governing human development. Many of my contemporaries found this irresistible because it offered both intellectual sophistication and moral purpose. They could feel simultaneously scientific and righteous, analytical and committed. Fascist ideology worked differently but with similar appeal. Rather than claiming scientific objectivity, it promised authentic community and cultural renewal. It appealed to intellectuals who felt alienated by modern mass society, offering them roles as cultural interpreters and spiritual guides. Both ideologies transformed political uncertainty into intellectual certainty, making adherents feel they possessed special knowledge unavailable to democratic Philistines. What made this particularly dangerous was that totalitarian simplicity contained just enough truth to be convincing. Capitalism did create genuine inequalities. Liberal democracy did sometimes seem inefficient. Modern society did generate authentic alienation. But instead of seeing these as permanent challenges requiring ongoing democratic response, totalitarian thinking presented them as problems to be solved once and for all through the correct application of the right theory. I remember conversations with colleagues who had become convinced that bourgeois democracy was merely a facade hiding class oppression, or that parliamentary government was too weak to defend national culture against cosmopolitan decadence. Their arguments were often sophisticated, their knowledge impressive, their moral concerns genuine. What they lacked was not intelligence or education but intellectual humility, the recognition that human knowledge has limits and that political action always involves unintended consequences. The appeal of totalitarian movements lay precisely in their promise to transcend these limitations. They offered escape from the burden of uncertainty, the frustration of compromise, the disappointment of incomplete solutions. In exchange for intellectual freedom, they provided intellectual security. In place of democratic argument, they substituted ideological certainty. This taught me that defending democracy requires more than exposing totalitarian lies. It requires cultivating appreciation for democratic virtues that may seem less satisfying than totalitarian promises, tolerance for disagreement rather than imposed consensus, provisional solutions rather than final answers, procedural fairness rather than substantive justice, incremental progress rather than revolutionary transformation. The most insidious aspect of totalitarian appeal was its ability to make democratic virtues appear as vices. Democratic tolerance became weakness, democratic compromise became betrayal, democratic pluralism became chaos. Totalitarian movements succeeded by convincing people that democracy's greatest strengths were actually its fatal flaws. Chapter 4: The Unintended Consequences of Utopian Politics. Nothing prepared me for the gap between totalitarian intentions and totalitarian results. The most horrifying aspect of 20th century European catastrophe was not that evil people did evil things, but that people convinced of their own righteousness created unprecedented suffering while believing they were building paradise. Soviet communism provides the starkest example. Lenin and his followers genuinely believed they were creating a society without exploitation, inequality, or oppression. Their theoretical framework convinced them that eliminating private property and bourgeois democracy would automatically produce human freedom and abundance. Instead, they created a system of state oppression that exceeded anything achieved by the tsars they had overthrown. The tragedy was not hypocrisy but sincere delusion. Communist leaders really believed that their temporary dictatorship would wither away, that their use of violence would eliminate violence forever, that their suppression of opposition would create genuine consensus. Their theoretical commitment blinded them to the actual consequences of their actions because those consequences contradicted their systematic understanding of historical development. Fascist movements exhibited similar patterns. They promised national renewal, cultural authenticity, and organic community. Many supporters genuinely believed they were defending traditional values against modern decadence. Instead, they created regimes that destroyed the very traditions they claimed to protect, replacing genuine community with mass manipulation and authentic culture with propaganda. What I learned was that political intentions matter far less than institutional consequences. The most dangerous political movements are often those motivated by the highest ideals because their moral certainty justifies overriding procedural safeguards designed to protect against abuse of power. When people believe they are implementing historical necessity or serving absolute truth, they feel authorized to ignore ordinary moral constraints. This is why I became convinced that political wisdom requires skepticism toward our own good intentions. The question is never whether our goals are noble, but whether our methods preserve space for error correction, opposition, and alternative approaches. Democratic politics may be frustratingly slow and incomplete, but it builds in safeguards against the kind of systematic errors that produce catastrophic results. The French experience with revolutionary politics provided additional confirmation of this pattern. The Jacobins who initiated the terror were not monsters but idealistic republicans convinced they were defending popular sovereignty against aristocratic conspiracy. Their willingness to use extreme measures flowed directly from their theoretical certainty about popular will and historical necessity. Similarly, the Russian revolutionaries who established the Soviet system began with genuine commitments to human liberation. But their theoretical framework made them unable to recognize that their methods contradicted their goals. They convinced themselves that destroying existing institutions would automatically create the new society they envisioned. What emerged instead was a pattern I came to call the paradox of revolutionary politics. The attempt to achieve perfect justice through political action inevitably produces new forms of injustice because political power cannot be perfected, only limited and divided. The utopian impulse to eliminate all sources of conflict and suffering leads to the concentration of power necessary to impose uniform solutions, which creates precisely the kind of oppression that utopian politics claims to eliminate. This insight led me to appreciate the wisdom embedded in democratic institutions that accept imperfection as permanent. Constitutional limits on government power, separation of powers, federalism, and civil liberties are not obstacles to justice but safeguards against the kind of systematic oppression that results from attempts to achieve perfect justice through political means. Chapter 5: Why Empirical Observation Beats Theoretical Systems. After watching Europe's intellectual elite lead their societies toward disaster through adherence to comprehensive theories, I became convinced that political wisdom requires a fundamentally different approach to understanding social reality. Instead of starting with theoretical systems and forcing facts to fit, we must begin with careful observation and build limited, provisional generalizations that remain always open to revision. This empirical approach taught me to distrust any political movement that claims to have discovered the fundamental laws of history or society. Human behavior is too complex, social systems too varied, and historical development too contingent for any single theory to capture adequately. What works in one context may fail catastrophically in another. What seems like an iron law of development may prove to be a temporary historical arrangement. I learned to ask different questions. Instead of, what does theory predict will happen? I asked, what is actually happening, and why might it be different from our expectations? Instead of, how can we implement our preferred system? I asked, what unintended consequences might result from this policy, and how can we detect and correct them early? This empirical orientation led me to appreciate the wisdom embedded in democratic institutions that seem theoretically messy but prove practically robust. Federalism appears inefficient compared to centralized planning, but it provides multiple opportunities for experimentation and error correction. Parliamentary opposition seems like mere obstruction, but it forces governing parties to defend their policies and consider alternatives they might otherwise ignore. The most important lesson was learning to distinguish between intellectual understanding and political action. Comprehensive theories may be intellectually satisfying, but they are politically dangerous because they encourage overconfidence in our ability to predict and control social outcomes. Democratic politics works better when guided by limited knowledge, careful observation, and willingness to change course when evidence contradicts expectations. This does not mean abandoning normative commitments or accepting everything as equally valid. Rather, it means holding our values firmly while remaining flexible about the means of implementing them and humble about our ability to foresee all consequences of our actions. My experience as a war correspondent and political journalist reinforced these lessons. I learned that social reality is always more complex than our theoretical frameworks suggest. Economic systems work differently than their models predict. Political movements develop in ways their founders never anticipated. International relations follow patterns that confound both realist and idealist theories. What proved most valuable was developing what I came to call sociological imagination, the ability to see social phenomena from multiple perspectives simultaneously, to recognize that every institution serves multiple functions and produces unintended consequences, to understand that social problems rarely have simple solutions because they emerge from the interaction of numerous variables. This approach led me to reject both conservative nostalgia and progressive utopianism in favor of what I called critical liberalism, a position that defends democratic institutions while remaining skeptical of claims about their perfectibility, that supports market economies while acknowledging their limitations, that values individual freedom while recognizing its social preconditions. The methodological lesson was that good social science requires the kind of intellectual humility that totalitarian ideologies explicitly reject. We must be willing to revise our theories when they conflict with evidence, to acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge, to accept that some problems may have no perfect solutions, and to prefer partial improvements over comprehensive transformations. This empirical approach also taught me to appreciate the evolutionary character of successful institutions. Democratic constitutions, market economies, and civil society organizations develop through trial and error over long periods. They embody accumulated wisdom about human behavior and social organization that no single theory can capture. Attempts to replace them with rationally designed alternatives typically fail because they cannot anticipate the complex ways that institutions actually function. Chapter 6: How Other Democracies Survive Through Institutional Wisdom. While continental Europe succumbed to totalitarian temptations, I observed with fascination how certain democratic societies proved more resilient against ideological seduction. The contrast was particularly striking between Germany and Britain during the interwar period, or between France and the United States during the height of Cold War tensions. British democracy survived not because Britain faced fewer challenges, but because British political culture had developed stronger antibodies against systematic thinking about politics. The British pragmatic tradition, with its suspicion of abstract theory and preference for incremental reform, proved more robust than continental European intellectualism. When confronted with economic crisis and social tension, British politicians focused on practical solutions rather than comprehensive transformations. American democracy demonstrated similar resilience through its institutional fragmentation. The separation of powers, federalism, and strong civil society created multiple centers of authority that prevented any single ideology from capturing the entire system. Even during periods of intense ideological pressure, McCarthyism, the Vietnam era, racial tensions, American institutions provided channels for opposition and mechanisms for course correction. What these successful cases taught me was the importance of political cultures that value procedural fairness over substantive agreement. In societies where people disagree fundamentally about the good life, religion, and social organization, democratic stability depends on shared commitment to fair procedures for handling disagreement rather than shared beliefs about final ends. I also observed the crucial role of intermediate institutions, universities, churches, professional associations, labor unions, business groups, in mediating between individuals and the state. These organizations provide alternative sources of authority and information that prevent any single political movement from achieving total ideological dominance. They create space for the kind of pluralistic debate that totalitarian movements must eliminate to maintain their claims to comprehensive truth. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that democratic survival requires active cultivation of democratic virtues among citizens, tolerance for disagreement, respect for opposition, willingness to compromise, and skepticism toward claims of absolute truth. These virtues cannot be taken for granted but must be continuously renewed through education and example. The Swiss case provided another instructive example of democratic resilience. Swiss political culture emphasized consensus building, local autonomy, and gradual change. The country's complex federal structure and tradition of direct democracy created multiple opportunities for citizen participation while preventing any single faction from dominating. Even when surrounded by totalitarian regimes, Swiss democracy remained stable because its institutions channeled conflict into peaceful competition. Scandinavian democracies offered yet another model of resilience. Their combination of strong social democratic traditions with respect for civil liberties and market economics created robust welfare states that maintained democratic legitimacy even during periods of economic stress. These societies demonstrated that it was possible to pursue egalitarian goals through democratic means without sacrificing political freedom. What all these successful cases shared was recognition that democracy is not a natural state but an artificial achievement that requires constant maintenance. Democratic institutions must be continuously adapted to changing circumstances while preserving their essential character. This requires political leaders capable of both principled commitment to democratic values and tactical flexibility in implementing them. The comparative analysis also revealed the importance of democratic political cultures that encourage criticism and self-correction. Healthy democracies develop mechanisms for identifying and addressing their own weaknesses before they become fatal flaws. This capacity for self-reform distinguishes resilient democracies from brittle authoritarian systems that cannot adapt to changing circumstances. Most significantly, I learned that democratic survival depends on citizens who understand that democracy is valuable not because it produces perfect outcomes but because it provides peaceful methods for handling disagreement and correcting mistakes. This requires a kind of civic education that emphasizes democratic virtues rather than ideological content. Chapter 7: Lessons for American Democratic Resilience. As I observe contemporary American political discourse, I see troubling parallels with the intellectual climate that preceded European catastrophe. The same preference for systematic explanations over empirical observation, the same impatience with democratic procedures, the same conviction that political opponents represent not merely alternative viewpoints but existential threats to civilization itself. Both progressive and conservative movements in America increasingly exhibit the kind of ideological thinking that proved so dangerous in Europe. Progressive ideology promises to solve historical problems of inequality and oppression through comprehensive social transformation, while conservative ideology promises to restore organic community and traditional values through return to imagined past arrangements. Both offer certainty where democratic politics must provide only provisional answers. What America retains, however, are institutional advantages that continental Europe lacked during its crisis period. The federal system continues to provide multiple laboratories for policy experimentation. The separation of powers creates genuine checks on executive authority. Civil society remains vibrant and diverse. Courts maintain some independence from immediate political pressure. But institutions alone cannot guarantee democratic survival. They must be supported by citizens who understand why democratic procedures matter more than substantive outcomes, why opposition serves essential democratic functions, and why intellectual humility proves more valuable than ideological certainty. The most important lesson from European experience is that democracy fails not when it faces external enemies but when its own citizens lose faith in democratic values. This happens when people become convinced that their political goals are so important that they justify overriding democratic procedures, or when they believe that political opposition represents not legitimate disagreement but treason against fundamental truth. Maintaining American democratic resilience requires conscious effort to cultivate intellectual virtues that sustain democratic culture, curiosity instead of certainty, evidence-based reasoning instead of theoretical deduction, willingness to change minds when confronted with new information, and respect for human dignity that transcends political disagreement. American political culture faces particular challenges that European democracies did not encounter. The scale and diversity of American society create communication problems that smaller, more homogeneous societies avoid. The role of mass media and social media in shaping public opinion introduces new forms of manipulation and polarization. The global reach of American power creates international pressures that most democracies do not face. Yet America also possesses resources for democratic renewal that European societies lacked. The tradition of constitutional government runs deeper and enjoys broader legitimacy. Civil society remains more robust and independent. The federal system provides more opportunities for democratic experimentation and innovation. The economy generates enough prosperity to reduce zero-sum political competition. The key question is whether American political culture can rediscover appreciation for democratic virtues that seem boring compared to ideological excitement. Can Americans learn to value procedural fairness over partisan victory? Can they cultivate tolerance for disagreement in an era of moral polarization? Can they maintain commitment to constitutional limits when those limits prevent achievement of desired outcomes? My experience suggests that this requires intellectual leadership committed to democratic values rather than ideological purity. America needs public intellectuals who model the kind of thinking that sustains democratic culture, empirical rather than theoretical, skeptical rather than certain, committed to democratic procedures rather than substantive outcomes. This also requires educational institutions that teach democratic virtues rather than ideological content. Students must learn to value evidence over theory, to appreciate complexity over simplicity, to respect opponents rather than demonize them. They must understand that democracy works not because it produces perfect justice but because it provides peaceful methods for pursuing justice. Most importantly, American democracy needs citizens who understand that their primary civic duty is not to achieve their preferred outcomes but to maintain the democratic system that makes peaceful pursuit of those outcomes possible. This requires the kind of civic virtue that puts constitutional procedures above partisan preferences and democratic values above ideological commitments. Conclusion. Europe destroyed itself twice through the intellectual failure to accept uncertainty as the permanent human condition. The catastrophes of 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945 resulted not from lack of idealism but from excess of systematic ideological thinking that promised final solutions to permanent problems. What I learned from witnessing these disasters is that democratic survival requires citizens capable of living with ambiguity, embracing procedural fairness over substantive certainty, and maintaining intellectual humility about the limits of human knowledge. America possesses institutional advantages that continental Europe lacked, but institutions alone cannot guarantee democratic resilience without citizens committed to democratic virtues over ideological purity. The choice facing America is the same one that faced Europe: whether to preserve the demanding but rewarding path of democratic politics or to succumb to the seductive simplicity of comprehensive ideological solutions.